Well, now the days are getting longer, a lot more of us are spending more time in the garden. And if you'd like to get some more ideas, then 2 exhibitions on at both Carrick Hill and the Botanical Gardens might help you. They're called the Lost Gardens of Adelaide and the Garden of Ideas. And I caught up with their curator, Richard Aitken, and asked him what they're all about.
One of the things that intrigues me about Australian gardening is just how regional it is, and that's why it's wonderful to do a show in Adelaide and focus on South Australia's heritage because, you know, South Australia generally, but Adelaide in particular, it's like a giant experimental laboratory.
When Melbourne-based garden historian Richard Aitken travels to Adelaide, he says he's always fascinated by how different the gardens are here. While the early settlers in places like Hobart were able to reproduce the English gardens of their homeland, Adelaide's new arrivals had to deal with a very different climate. And these early images show they were more skilled at dealing with a drier climate than we are.
It's a dry city, Adelaide. It's a dry state. It's very hot. We need shade. All those things that were very apparent to the earliest colonists from, you know, a moment's observation are coming home with, I think, greater force these days.
How did he get all these plants watered?
Well, the first thing you notice is there's no lawn. It's all raked gravel, bare earth and plants. So in that sense, it's a very water-wise kind of garden. I'm guessing that he had the wealth to cart water. I mean, he's out in Prospect. There's not a lot of water close by. You know, it would have taken a team of gardeners to look after a garden like this.
Richard Aitken's book, The Garden of Ideas, features one of South Australia's extraordinary colonial gardens. It surrounded Prospect House in Prospect. 4 original watercolours by S.T. Gill still survive. One of them's on display at the Botanic Gardens Museum, and the other 3 are at Carrick Hill. The watercolours were commissioned to capture the house and garden in all their glory. One of the most impressive scenes is the view from the balcony of the house. The works of art survive, but the house and garden are lost forever.
I think it was pulled down at about the turn of the century. It was built in 1846 to 48 by J.B. Graham, who was a mining magnate, had made his money at Burra, and it's a, you know, it's a wonderful, it's a virtuoso display of wealth, really, isn't it?
He's also fascinated with the Botanic Gardens themselves. They were laid out in 1855, and he says there's still a dazzling display of interlinked compartments, and the best example from colonial Australia of a mix of the formal and informal. The gardens are also immensely significant historically.
The earliest plant acclimatisation was done through the Botanic Gardens. Plants were coming in. Botanic Gardens was seen a kind of natural place or depot for those plants to be grown and trialled.
Another lost garden is the part of the Botanic Gardens immediately to the left of the present main gate on North Terrace. This became part of the Royal Adelaide Hospital in the 1950s, and not far from the main gate on the right-hand side is a memorial to the garden's first director, George Francis. One of his early plans of the gardens that includes the section now lost to the hospital is also on display.
So one of the really curious things is this almost face at the gate. People will know this entrance on North Terrace to the Botanic Garden, but who realise that the gate is actually a nose and there's this pair of eyes there at the gardens. Francis was a very witty man, and I don't think this is an accident.
And if the state government does want to restore the gardens to their former glory when the hospital's moved, the plans by George Francis are there to do it.
Like Colonel Light, he was a surveyor, and I think that will be no surprise when you see the intricacy of the plan. Most of this was actually implemented. Some of it in the northern area was more in the way of a master plan. One of the most interesting things is this series of 4 circles here, which was an Australian plant garden, one of the very earliest, and each of the circles was dedicated to the indigenous plants of a different colony.
This photo from the early 1860s shows George Francis standing in front of his palatial Victorian glasshouse. This too was destroyed to make way for the hospital expansion 60 years ago.
The gardens lost this great swathe of land. I think, you know, probably about 50 metres of North Terrace frontage by 150 metres. That's a very substantial area, and so I guess, you know, if the hospital were to move, it would be lovely to do something that perhaps recaptured the former glory of that.
Richard Aitken's exhibition of lost gardens is on at Carrick Hill. His Garden of Ideas is on at the Museum of Economic Botany in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens, and they both run through until the end of February 2011.